Welcome to the Umbrella Hour. This is Dr. On and Zander Keig, licensed social worker. Zander will be introducing our guest today.
Well, it is my pleasure to introduce to you a longtime friend of mine. This is the Reverend Dr. Megan Rohrer. Megan is a communications specialist and is the first openly transgender bishop or in a major Christian denomination. He was featured on Netflix's Queer Eye. Megan is considered a controversial activist and is known for their advocacy for the homeless and the LGBTQ communities. And they received an honorable mention as an unsung hero of compassion by wisdom and action by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. That is an extraordinary way to introduce Megan to you, but I want to add in a few more pieces. Megan and I met almost 21 years ago at the Pacific School of Religion when I was first starting my graduate degree in theology or theological systems. And Megan was friends with a roommate of mine at the time. Perhaps they were a couple, I believe. Yes. Let's not mention names. And over the years, we have collaborated on several different projects, including the Welcome Ministry, which I hope Megan will talk about. We have published 2 books together, Letters for My Brothers and Manifest. Letters for My Brothers, both of them are anthologies. So they have stories that are written by trans men and a couple of people that might consider themselves more trans masculine. We also worked on an oral history project together where my voice was captured in story form for a oral history project. And then that was converted into a documentary that Megan illustrated called Zanderology, which has traveled around the world and even been award-winning in some countries outside of the United States. And for me, the biggest honor of all for me is that Megan is the one who convinced me to ask Margaret out for a date. And Margaret and I have been married now, or at least we've been together. I call it married. I'm going to take credit for the whole time, for nearly 21 years, because it was only a couple of weeks into school at PSR, Pacific School of Religion, that I asked Margaret out on a date. And we are still together, happily, living in Orlando, Florida. And so welcome, Megan, to the show.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
I'm going to zero in on one particular word in your bio, the more professional bio. You refer to yourself as a controversial activist. What do you mean by that?
I think in different decades of my life, it's meant different things. I grew up in South Dakota, which for folk who don't even know where South Dakota is on the map, if you fold the United States in half and fold it in half the other way, you'll get to South Dakota, but that's about all people remember. It's right in the middle, lots of farm people, like Betty Crocker. If you're a girl in the orchestra, you wear a dress. If you're a boy, you wear a tie, and none the twain in between shall meet. So very kind of conservative, very, very, you have your role. Everyone's going to just get married the year after high school and be together forever. That's sort of what it was like when I was growing up. And so coming out as a lesbian and then figuring out the word genderqueer as that word got invented, and then being a trans person, very unusual for that space. Actually had to move off campus for 3 months during college because people were trying to throw holy water on me and would sing hymns when I was nearby. I kind of liked church, so I tried to sing harmony, but it was weird and unsafe. And so I moved to Berkeley where we went to school together to kind of do religion at a time when the Lutheran Church, which I'm a part of, didn't allow openly gay people to be serving in the church. In fact, there's actually a letter of the head of the Lutheran Church at that time convincing President Bill Clinton that the way they do it in the church is so great, maybe they should try it in the military, this don't ask, don't tell kind of idea. And so the Lutheran Church sort of would punish you if they figured out you were gay or someone else figured out you were gay. But if you were quiet about it, then you could kind of serve in the church. And so I was a part of a group of people who got ordained extraordinarily. And basically we used this old set of rules from the 1500s that said when bishops are jerks, and I'm actually saying it nicer than Martin Luther said it, but when bishops are jerks and they say you can't be a pastor unless you're celibate, because way back in the oldie times, forcing celibacy on people caused problems in society, similar to the problems we see today when it's forced. So these rules said if you try to force people to be celibate, you should break the church's rules and get ordained anyway. And the people in the church should just vote. And so this old set of rules called the Small Called Articles, we followed those. And there were about 18 of us that got ordained extraordinarily, breaking the church's rules, but following the older set of rules. And through that ordination of the people coming together, I got to serve the homeless and work with the welcome ministry. I had a call from 4 churches, one called Her Church that only used female language for God, one St. Francis that only used genderqueer language from God and had a very sparkly rainbow queer congregation. Another congregation called Christ Church, and they only used Lord language and very hierarchical Lord language. And then Santa Maria y Santa Marta in San Francisco that only spoke Spanish and used El Señor when they talked about God. And so I got to serve for like 12 years working with just whoever I encountered on the streets and eating with people and feeling like that was a controversial act to do, because in church school, this idea of who is going to be the best or the fanciest pastor is the one that's going to have the biggest church with the fanciest, with the most embroidery, and is going to have the most people there. And so to work with those with the least money, with ragtag clothes a retired pastor donated that you sewed up to be able to work, was a very controversial way to do ministry, still is a very controversial way to do ministry. And the idea was that everyone wanted to climb the ladder and become a bishop or something fancy. And strangely, I did climb that ladder. I ended up getting elected bishop with winning by 1 vote, which I always thought was delightful. It sort of makes you a bit controversial. What if we changed our mind, right? But what I loved about it is everyone I encountered would say it was me. I was that 1 vote. I changed my mind, and I'm the reason. And they felt like for the first time in the church, their vote mattered. Their showing up at one of those meetings mattered. It was really lovely. And the other person who was in the last 2 of the vote to be bishop was this pioneering out gay pastor who had been the first of the pastors to get ordained extraordinarily, and he deserved every single vote. And I would not want to have been elected bishop except for with it being very close. Then I served as bishop. It made world headlines, and not necessarily in the fun way, in a world where here in the United States, there's over 400 anti-trans bills going on right now. It meant I had to buy a bulletproof vest for worship services. The place where I worked got so much hate mail that we could no longer answer the phones with a human being. It all had to go to voicemail so that we could track who was sending the messages. And as a part of my role, I think what happens, and we see it in history with every trans person who becomes the first in a new kind of job, there are some people who are so excited for the change, and then a whole other group of people who don't trust your leadership, who question the work you do. Being a bishop's a job sort of like a therapist, in that there's a lot of confidentiality. And a lot of the work that you do isn't stuff that you can share publicly. And it's really hard to do a job like that if there is a mistrust that happens to be about who you are or how you are embodied in the world. And so I've always been someone who has what I like to call trans theology without apology, meaning people might want to pick a fight or debate who I am or what I believe, but I don't always show up. I try to act with love and grace and kindness. And so in my role as a bishop, I just thought, okay, you can question every decision I make, but I'm not necessarily going to pick a fight with you. I've got work to do and a lot of people who need care and help. And I think we live in a world of the internet where people can spread rumors on the internet and it can gain traction and look true. And in the midst of holding confidence, you have to choose, would I rather debate this in the public sphere and injure people, or would I rather be the best that I can and have it look bad in a headline for a day or two? And so what I chose to do is to do my best, to live my ethics and to move forward. And when it got to be too difficult to do that, for example, I lost 50 pounds in 3 months from stress, just from amount of people who were, let's just say, grumpy online. Let's say it that way. My body was literally eating itself. That's how I lost that weight so quickly. And so I chose to be alive. And so I resigned from that position, hoped that it would give me space, care for my kids and care for myself and do that radical work that I would rather do, and go back to doing work with the homeless again, which is where I am, back in the Tenderloin at a congregation that is very well known for being controversial and being proactive on social issues and caring for myself and suing the Lutheran Church for discrimination and harassment at the same time. And so I don't want to be the kind of person who has to be the first and try to make ground for other people. It's not fun. I'm more of an introvert. I'd rather write books and do art projects with you, Zander. But here I am, right? And so I find myself being controversial in a lot of ways. Although if I think about who I am myself, I just feel like I'm a papa and I'm a writer and I'm someone who spends more time listening in my normal day-to-day life than talking, and is just trying to make the world a better place. And I've worn a lot of hats, but the through line, I think, is that I try to amplify other people's voices. I try to find ways to solve problems that other people in society might have thought is too hard to solve, and then to sit with people in the ache. I continue to be that person, and I feel like naming that I'm controversial makes it easier when people Google me and see a bunch of people are mad about me for something or another.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I've watched the whole process in San Francisco, including my community here in Florida, grow leaps and bounds in the homeless camp. People are just houseless everywhere. And I'm seeing a variety of ages now that I've never seen before, that I know were there, but now those are growing in magnitude. What's different today, or is it all the same?
In San Francisco, it feels like things go in waves. There's times when there is really tough policing and it sweeps the places that people sleep into the recesses where you don't notice them, like underneath highway underpasses and deep into park where you wouldn't necessarily encounter them on a day-to-day space. And then there are other times when folk just camp in the middle of, like in San Francisco, there was a decade where for maybe 2 years straight, people just put their tents across the street from City Hall. And part of it was political, part of it was where there's not a lot of flat places in San Francisco. Nobody wants to put their tent on a hill. I think there is a combination of things growing more expensive in the grocery store that is a piece of it. Here in San Francisco, having to pay just astronomical amounts of money to live indoors, even to live in this place where we are, the deposit was 3 times the first month's rent. So you have to pay the equivalent of 4 months rent just to move in for that first opportunity to come indoors. And so there are barriers like that are really difficult. I think there's also ways in which weather shifts and changes, right? In South Dakota, a lot fewer homeless people in the winter, right? Florida, San Francisco, places that have weather that might be more livable longer periods of the year. I think there's ways in which more people have the ability to live in those spaces. But I also see from hearing conversations with homeless people that there's a lot of trauma that has impacted the way people make their life choices. It didn't get dealt with in a timely way. And by timely, I mean like in the first 3 decades after that trauma happened. And it's become so hard now to turn it around that people just don't know what to do. So, for example, there's a group of people who live on the streets of San Francisco because the last place they lived indoors long-term burned down. And anytime they go inside, they feel like the place is going to burn down if they fall asleep. And that's a type of trauma that people could get care for, but who and how and where, right? I live in a house, but the houses in San Francisco are so close together, I can hear when my neighbor's TV is on. There are people who are triggered by sounds and smells. And when you're always hearing what's going on in your neighbor's house, it doesn't feel like there's a way to escape some of that. The hardest part for me living indoors during COVID is we didn't have a backyard and we have 2 elementary school kids, right? And they just need to like run and jump sometimes. And I think there's something that changes when you don't have different kinds of wellness personal spaces that makes it really hard for people to navigate tough transitions in their life. We don't have in San Francisco good adult protective services. But we also had a period of time where all of the spaces that were providing adult care closed. And we didn't have a way to transition people from institutional living to living independently. And so I knew a bunch of people who never met their parents because they were born with learning disabilities that were very severe. And they were back in the time when the idea was put them in this place where they can live, that will be the best for them. They never even met their parents. And those institutions closed. No one taught them how to open a can to eat soup. They were able to get disability support, but nobody taught them how to write a check. And so they didn't have the kind of support that people might have if they have a family that tracks with them through their whole life. And so you see some instances where trauma care, even now, could help, where life skills training really would help a lot of people. But for some people, it's hard. Like if you've been just working it out, who's going to be the one who's the principal, or who's going to be the one that's the parent, right? It's really hard to learn those skills as an adult, even when you're choosing to learn them, let alone to have a person be the one who tells you that you need to learn that from the outside. And then there's the whole other crisis that's really been festering and growing for a lot of years in the United States of not knowing what to do about addiction recovery. Is it something that we can force on people? Is it something that we should just let people live and let live? Is it okay if you're functioning in your job, but not okay if you're on the streets and bothering people? Like, when is it a thing that gets a fence put around it so that people can have boundaries? And when is it a thing that doesn't get boundaries? And then what do you do if people have lost everything? And so their ability to live into their addiction even deeper goes to a place where it's just out there, right? And so I see there being a lot of swirling stuff. I wish that there was a way to have like a new deal. Let's just try everything. Because not everything in the New Deal worked or was helpful, and it was incredibly expensive. But what I appreciate, I just appreciate when people are like, let's try everything. And then when we find what works, let's do that more. And when we find what doesn't work, maybe let's do that less. Let's try it this way. And I feel like there's not a lot of creativity and exploration that's happening in the ways that we're trying to respond to homelessness. And it gets grumpy and annoying. Like, I want to take my kids, right? I want to take my elementary school kids to school without them learning how to use drugs on the walk, right? And so I wish I had a magic wand that would make things at least better enough that it was noticeable, because then I think people would want to explore some of those opportunities more. And it's just a hard, swirly thing.
Well, you talk about all the different things that are impacting individuals. One of the things about San Francisco, and I think most major metropolitan areas around the country, is the lack of housing, for example, for Section 8. When I was Department of Veterans Affairs social worker in the Healthcare for Homeless Veterans program in San Francisco, and then Oakland, and then down in San Diego, what we were always dealing with was a lack of units available for our HUD-VASH, the Section 8 voucher recipients that were the chronically homeless veterans. We had transitional housing programs. Those were plentiful. And we had temporary housing, right? We had beds at shelters across the city and county of San Francisco, in Alameda and Contra Costa, and all up and down the state and all across the country. This is a national program with the VA. But the housing first model is, regardless of addiction, whether a person's using or not, they went into housing, and then we connected them with their primary care services and specialty care services and drug and alcohol treatment if they wanted it, and employment specialists. I mean, everybody. But if we couldn't find a unit for them, if we couldn't find an apartment, a house, a townhome, that was always the biggest thing. And so one of the things I love about the work that you've done is people might be imagining it like, okay, you're a minister, right? You're a reverend, and you're ministering to the homeless. And I think people think that means like homeless people are coming into your church. And yes, that's true. That's something that you have obviously dealt with. But you said something, I love it. I wrote it down. You said, I sit with people in the ache. And that immediately made me think about when you were doing street ministry and you would spend time living among the people that were living on the streets. And you didn't do that for one night or 2 nights. You did it for night after night after night, for several nights in a row. And so you have this experience of actually being with people and learning about their lives and connecting them with services and resources and making referrals. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about what that experience was like, because I know you did it more than once.
We are going to take our first commercial break. 365 days a year.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
We are back from our first commercial break with Dr. Reverend Rohrer. Let's pick up where we left off.
Yeah, for 10 years, every year, I would sleep on the streets for a week at a time. And it's not the same as being homeless, right? Because I could see where my house was from where I was. But the idea was that I would utilize some of the places I would refer people to, because then you sort of learn like, oh, who works there now? What are their hours? Go see Janice in aisle 5. She's really nice, and things like that. That would really help people feel like I knew what I was talking about when I was referring people. And then it would also help me make changes. I was eating with people regularly and having conversations with them. And you don't really understand why a metal chair is the worst until you've slept on the concrete for 3 nights in a row, right? Oh, my back. And so you begin to kind of solve some of the things that make the spaces that you're interacting with people inhospitable, and people notice when you do that. It actually was fun too, because there were some people who met me while I was doing my week on the streets, and so they were like, we're so proud of Megan. They used to be homeless and now they run this program and they're doing all of this stuff. And for me, it was about people feeling like you were with them and you didn't look down on them, and learning from them. And I think it helps too to like imagine what kinds of things you want people to do to help with too. Like I remember there was this time where the really fancy churches in town for Thanksgiving, they would imagine what is expensive for me, that if I gave it to someone who was poor, it would help them out, right? And people would donate like used skis to the homeless program and stuff like that, because skis are expensive, right? And during a time when they liked eating turkey or they liked eating ham, they would give the homeless people frozen turkeys and frozen hams. Homeless people don't have ovens. It's the dumbest present ever, right? And so it would be all over the news, though, in San Francisco. This fancy church gave away 1,000 turkeys today. And then people would send them giant checks because, yeah, you gave frozen turkeys to homeless people. And then the homeless people in San Francisco would literally use the turkeys to go bowling in the streets. Because what are you going to do with it? Right? You're never going to be able to eat it. And so being with people, you figure out why, if you don't change your socks in 4 days, what happened to me when I was on the streets is the dye from inside of your socks starts to go inside of your skin and spreading, like as if you ever like had writing on your skin and then it spreads out through your pores. That's what happens when you leave your socks on too much. And so homeless people will tell you like socks are like gold, because a pair of new athletic socks, the kind where the dye is not going to run if you get sweaty, is one of the best gifts you can give someone. Or one of the times that I was on the streets, I got my menstruation. And try to be someone on the streets in a city where they don't let you use the bathroom if you're not buying something. And even if you're buying something, a lot of the stores won't even let you use your bathroom. Be someone who's menstruating and on the streets is a really difficult thing. I stayed in the shelter system, never lied about my background or anything, even wrote my home address on stuff when I was going through. So I never got like a shelter bed that someone else had applied for on the same evening and needed more than me. Went through the shelter system, changed my gender in the shelter system from female to male to see what is it like for a trans person as they're going through that process. And it was terrifyingly scary to think that I actually got placed in the men's shelter where they have like communal showers. And I just thought, holy crap. I was remembering the people who were trans who had told me stories about how they took a shower in the men's shelter and someone would steal their clothes, and then how scary that was as a process of what would happen. And so you learn a lot about things that need fixing. Here's an interesting thing that's actually been really helpful for my life is a lot of people, when they want to like learn how to be kind or learn how to be spiritual, they go to like fancy spa places where of course you can feel like you're having this on top of a mountain moment, because you might be on top of a mountain. And there was this Zen priest named Bernie Glassman, and he believed that it was a much more enlightened spiritual practice to try to figure out how to still be kind and have a spiritual moment when you're uncomfortable, right? So sleeping on the sidewalks was a way for your bones to be so super uncomfortable. And who will you be when you're that uncomfortable? Will you still be faithful? Will the words you say still, as a pastor, am I still a pastor when I am crabby? Being able to do that and has been really helpful in my own kind of personal growth and in my own ability to be patient with people. And I think it's part of why people make a fuss or assume the wrong things about me it agitates me a little bit less because it's still not as bad as like hanging out on the concrete in the rain and having your menstruation and no bathroom, right? And so I feel like it builds a tolerance in me and a resiliency in me that makes it possible for me to maybe walk through some of the other kind of discriminatory or uncomfortable or typical slings and arrows that people face just being in a job and having a boss and things like that.
Something you said about we could go to the Zen Buddhist monastery at the top of the mountain, or it made me think about a book that I read. My father gave me a book when I went off to college in the 1990s. It's called A Path with Heart by Jack Kornfield. And Jack Kornfield had studied and practiced and become ordained as a Buddhist monk. I think I'm not sure if he was in the mountains or in the forest, but he was definitely in a very serene place. And then he came back to New York and he was sitting on the subway and he's like, how do I practice my Zen in this environment? Because he became so discombobulated, and that was his new practice that he begun. And then he teamed up with a lot of other people who had been trained in Eastern traditions and come home to the West, and they founded some retreat centers around the country. And the one that Jack Kornfield is one of the founders of is Spirit Rock in, I believe, Marin County, up north of San Francisco. And I've been there twice on two different silent retreats. One was a 2-day or 2-night, 3-day, and one was a 4-night, 5-day silent retreat. So, I mean, it's like learning how to do it, but in the environment, right? In a more urban environment. It's not the same practice. You did slip in there a little bit ago that you're an introvert, which is probably hard for people to believe. When I tell people I'm an introvert, they don't really believe it. And I say, well, I can play an introvert on TV, right? Just being silly. I understand what you mean. Your life is about being of service. Everything you've done is for service. That's one of the things that we have in common. You've just done it in really big ways and in different places and spaces than I have. But you mentioned something about when you were talking about being controversial, having to make a decision about, am I going to disclose something that should be held in confidence that could harm another person's life? Or am I going to maintain that confidence, be ethical, and bear the brunt of the social media rumor mills? And I had a really small example of that when I got Social Worker of the Year in 2020. There were like 3 or 4 people. That's it. 3 or 4 people who were very unhappy about that, but they have so many fans and followers that all of a sudden I started getting calls and emails from people who were concerned about how transphobic I was, as a trans person. They really do have a far reach. That little bit that I've been through is terrible, and you've been through something that's so much bigger than that. I'm sending you much love through these audio files. Have you heard of the book San Francisco, written by Michael Schellenberger, who ran for California governor?
No, but it sounds fun.
I thought you might find it interesting because you mentioned something about addiction and treatment and homelessness or people without houses. And I think in San Francisco, Michael Schellenberger, he writes about that. And so it might be an interesting read for you.
Yeah, I'll check it out.
He ran for governor when there was that recall election.
Yeah, I feel like I heard him on the radio at some point. I get it, because there is a way in which hustle culture and a lot of the tech companies have offices in San Francisco. There's a way in which San Francisco has always been like a gold rush kind of place. It's been about come here, get rich, and ignore the consequences that happen. And people don't always know that San Francisco had very strict immigration laws that made people of Chinese descent stay on Angel Island for years in prison housing to try to ensure that only men would come so that they wouldn't procreate when they were in San Francisco. Just some really terrible racism that went on for a lot of years. There was a lot of movement that happened to kind of push Japanese Americans into prisons during the war, and ways in which San Francisco's conquering spirit has been really difficult on different populations in the community. And the Tenderloin sort of becomes the location where that becomes the most visible. The Tenderloin in San Francisco is a space where the most affordable housing is. It's the place that the city allows garbage to pile up in the streets because it's a community that isn't going to be thought of as people who can politically organize in a way that wouldn't put up with that. And so each decade you see a different group of people, whoever is the group that is the have-nots. And so a few blocks away is Union Square, where all of the haves are going to come to Macy's and be on a very expensive hotel. And so you have within a few blocks those who have the least and those who have the most who might be passing through the area. And also at the same time, you have a lot of empty housing here because people want to own San Francisco property because it does better than the stock market a lot of times in terms of the amount of income you can gain if you hold on to your property, or at least that's the way people think about it. And so there's empty houses all over the place from people who live in other spaces primarily. There's a lot of people who have no housing. There's a lot of very fancy tech businesses, which kind of come and go, right? The new cool thing of this decade ends up in San Francisco. And so you can see how this process leads to new waves of homelessness and a different population then that is the have-nots of this couple of years. And so right now in the Tenderloin, there's a lot of Middle Eastern families. There are refugees from a lot of other countries. It's mostly families with kids, but on the street level, it's a lot of garbage piled up and a lot of addiction that's really present during the day, and a lot of homelessness that's very, very present. And I don't know what the right combination is. I wish there was like a penicillin for poverty that would actually fix the root causes so that we could move forward. But it does seem like it's something that sort of swirls, and it's a combination of what is the group that isn't able for whatever reasons to earn enough to feel like they can live in places that don't have those problems. And the fact that it kind of keeps swirling back on itself really does feel like it's a sickness that keeps coming.
Well, I think that most people associate a boom town with prosperity, but there's always also poverty.
Yes.
Not everybody is booming, right?
Some of the things that I'm working on right now are conversations about that, because I've been now working and being a part of the Tenderloin and the Polk, which is just a little farther up the hill, a little trolley car ride up the hill for those who want to imagine it with a bell. I'm doing some really fun personal projects. Like I've been filling the potholes in the sidewalks with tile mosaics of flowers. I did this really big tile mosaic project on a bunch of stairs at a congregation that I was at. And I've been trying to think about how devastating it is that there are places where the city's okay with there just being trash everywhere. And what would it be like if there were flowers everywhere? I do a lot of world travel. It gives me my ideas for my art a lot. And I was in Uruguay, and there were these old cobblestone roads that looked like they were thousands of years old. And when one stone would go missing, they would fill it in with these beautiful mosaics. And it was contemporary art that just someone had chose to do because no one was going to fix the pothole that was in the sidewalk. And so when I came back, I want to start fixing the potholes. And I don't have the full mixture, right? Filling concrete sidewalks is a little bit difficult with all of the grit and grime. Like you got to figure out how you can get your mosaics to stand up to power motor scooters and all of those things. But this idea of having a small thing that I can fix from entirely broken to something that's beautiful has always been healing for me. And so I work at a congregation that used to have a very large choir of over 100 people singing in it. And now they have maybe 40. And so they wanted to get rid of a bunch of the old choir robes. And so I got all of the fabric, and my kids and I taught my kids to sew. We're making them into quilts that we're giving away to the homeless on our walk back to the church, because there's this idea, like I said before, that just the fancy people get the churches with the embroidery and all of the cool garments. And so I've been taking the fabric, the beautiful fabrics of churches that have closed, or things like these choir robes that aren't needed anymore, and giving them to the homeless. Because in my theology, there's this idea that whoever are the least should be treated the best. And so taking sacred garments and making them into things that the homeless need, for me, is a very fulfilling thing, to like take a thing that would have been thrown away and to make it beautiful. Like I have this quilt from my great grandma, and we don't use it very often because we're afraid it will fall apart. But to give it to the people who will use it utterly and throw it away, to give a beautiful thing to someone who's going to get it dirty, is love. because it's not normal in our society to give beautiful things to people who are just going to get them muddy and throw them away. And so it's been fun to try to find ways to bring beauty to people who have mostly only experienced trauma. I think that's what I've discovered in my time with the homeless, is that we can give folk what we think they need. And that can be a helpful and fulfilling thing. But if our idea is, I have now fed a homeless person and you don't think they're going to be hungry again at the next meal, we're not that powerful from our one gift. And should we give? Yes. But there's this old Buddhist mantra: when should you give to a beggar? When you need it, when it is helpful for you. And that's a selfish way to think of it. But the Buddhist idea is more this, is you don't know what happens once you give the thing away. And if you want to control the person who gets it and tell them what to do with the thing you gave, you never gave it away. Make the giving beautiful and detach from what happens next. I like sewing. It makes my wellness better. I can give a beautiful thing. I can give a beautiful quilt away, or I like doing a tile project. I'm a renter, so it's not like I can retile my own house, but I can fix this pothole. And so I can spend my whole life being angry that I trip in the pothole in the sidewalk, or I can make something beautiful. And so much of my world, so much of my life is not fixable, and it's big, right? And this is a task I can complete and check off the list and walk away from. And then when I walk through the tunnel, I'm like, it's really cool, right? And so I hope that people will find ways that getting your own wellness fixes a thing the world needs. And it doesn't have to be so big that you have made salt-free in India like Gandhi. It can just be a thing that makes you well. And maybe it helps another person who doesn't trip in the sidewalk. But get away from this idea that you have to give only if it's going to change the whole world. Give out of what heals you, and that will heal other people, whether they tell you about it or not.
We are headed into our second commercial break. We will be back shortly.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
We are back from our second break.
I really resonated with that idea of you're not really giving it away if you want to control how it's used, whatever it is, whatever you're giving to somebody. There's two things that come to mind. One is the mandalas, the painstaking time and effort to make something so beautiful out of colored sand. And then when it's all finished, they just wipe it away. It also reminds me of that story you told about giving sacred garments to people who are just going to get them all malodorous and muddy. This idea of giving it away and not controlling where it goes. When I was serving in the Coast Guard, I was young. I was 20, 21 years old. I was living on base, so I was making very little money. And I took a second job. I got permission to work off base in my off hours at a place called AM/PM. It's a little convenience store, but we didn't have a gas station. But in San Diego, where I was, it was just this little AM/PM. And I would go to work, it was a couple of days a week in the evenings, usually the weekends. And there would be this young couple, maybe late teens, early 20s, about my same age, a young man, a young woman with this beautiful little chocolate colored cat. And they would be there all the time. And so I would buy groceries for them from the AM/PM. I'd fill up a bag full of the cans that you could pull open. You didn't need a can opener, and I would give them all kinds of things from the store. I'd pay for it myself. And then one day I showed up and I handed them $300 or $400, which was a lot of money for a very junior enlisted person in the Coast Guard in San Diego at the time. Again, this would have been like 1987. And then I didn't see them. Every time I went to work, they were never there. They were just gone. And I had no idea. 4 or 5 years go by and I've moved to another city. I'm now in Santa Rosa, California. I'm walking in the mall and one day I hear somebody call my name, which wasn't Zander at the time. So I'm not going to really repeat it, but who is that? And I turn around, it's the security guard. And I was like, why does the security guard know my name? Like, but if you know my history, that's not too surprising. But anyway, it turns out it was that guy. What they did is they took that money, they went down into Mission Valley, which is where there's a lot of hotels in San Diego. They got a room. They spent a whole week in there. They basically got sleep. They got to take showers. They got to eat some good hot food. They also made phone calls to their parents because there weren't cell phones and things back then. There were pay phones. And so they made phone calls and they each committed to doing better for themselves. So they had moved to Santa Rosa where this guy's parents were. They got married. He got trained as a security guard and he was working in the mall as a security guard. I've had more experiences like that just touch me to no end because again, I had no idea. And the fact that he remembered me, because I'm not even sure how sober they were. He remembered me all those years later and called out my name. So it's like, just let it go into the world. Let your goodness, your kindness, your generosity, your empathy, your compassion, whatever it is, your suspicion, whatever it is, let it go into the world. Don't try and control it because you have no idea how it's going to affect that person's life and other people's lives in addition to that, because they got married, they had a kid, they had a life, they had family. That was not something that was easily predictable from their circumstances, hanging out in front of the AM/PM.
Yeah, and I think that's good advice too for what happens in the shifts and turns of your life, right? One person's controversy is another person's hero. And so you can be a pioneer in one community and hated by people in a different community. And if you hold on to every person that doesn't like you and what they said, if in the middle of the night at 4:30 in the morning, the voice that wakes you up is a negative comment that someone said, and it's never you're waking up because you're thinking, oh, it was so nice that someone said that very nice thing to me today. Like, I don't know about you, but I rarely wake up in the morning recanting and remembering the nice things that people have said. And so it's like, you gotta find ways to let go of this idea that you're gonna stay the same and that the way people are going to judge a situation is going to stay the same. And even if everyone agrees that you're terrible, you got to kind of like let it go and see what history decides about that, or if it's going to stick. I've also had moments where people want credit in retrospect because they switch sides, right? When I told you that story of the people who used to throw holy water on me. There's not a single person from that period of my life who hasn't come back to say, I'm sorry on social media. And never in a million years did I imagine that would ever happen. And I unfortunately can't promise to everyone listening that everyone who says something terrible is going to come back and say sorry, because that's not how life always shakes out in the twists and turns. But you never know, right? You never know what's going to be next week's way of looking back on what you're up to. And as a trans person, I particularly say that out loud because I think trying to have laws that give boundaries to people or tell them what they can and cannot do, that's one thing. What I've noticed about the way some people approach trans people is that they not only want them to have laws that tell what their body should do or how they should be in the world, but sometimes there is this idea of if we can't legislate it, we can make them feel ashamed and to not like themselves. And so there's a way in which discrimination takes a whole second turn, which is I'm going to make you second guess yourself. I want to be the voice in your head that wakes you up at 4:30 in the morning. And when people can't shake that, or they can't imagine a future, they sometimes take their own lives. And so particularly if you are someone out there who has the voices popping up that tell you things that are untrue, if there have been people of faith who have told you you're anything less than beloved, I'm sorry, officially, and do what you can to shake those voices. If you have to pretend you don't care for a while until you do, pretend you don't care. If you have to go put mosaics in the sidewalks or move to a different country where people won't be rude or whatever it is, go to a sci-fi convention and put on a costume of a bunny rabbit. Live through those feelings long enough that you can see what happens next, because something different does happen next. Can't predict it always, but I just want to say that really, really clearly, particularly for those who feel like they're on the edge or like there's not a future for them. That's part of what has also been one of my through lines, is that by just being someone who in public does a new thing or has a different, like, I'm not a bishop anymore, but I'm not done, right? I'm doing a new thing. Being someone who can publicly take heat and keep being kind is, I think, an important thing that the world wants and needs and notices, whether or not they say it out loud. So yes, shake off all the ways that things kind of linger, because you never know where it will go. But also also like, if you can, try to like get the nice things people say to stick a little deeper as often as possible too. There's this kind of ancient story about a person named Hotep, and Hotep had a bag, and Hotep's idea was that the goal in life was to need what would be asked of you before it was asked. And so in Hotep's bag was like everything. My family comes from depression survivors, and so that meant they just kept everything in case someone would need it in the future. I don't think it means that. I don't think it means like save every Tupperware if it's broken. But I think what it means is you never know which thing that you come across is going to be the thing what is asked of you next. If you're the person who's got a bag full of rocks, watch out. I don't think it's a coincidence that there was an entire movement of people putting googly eyes on rocks and calling them pets, right? People even found a thing to do with the rocks in their life. And so I think you just never know. I think people need cynicism, and people need someone who's going to be hopefully optimistic, and people need people who are going to be in all of those different layers and levels, and just trust that you're going to encounter the people who need that, and that you being authentically yourself, googly eyes, all the ways that your skin changes over time, you being yourself is the exact medicine or gift that someone's going to need to make it through their next step.
I just thought of one of my favorite movies, a line from Forrest Gump, when the guy is running alongside him with a t-shirt and he's trying to come up with something to put on, a slogan to come up on a t-shirt, and Forrest Gump is running, and then he steps into a pile of, dog poop, and the guy's like, "You just stepped in shit." And he's like, "It happens." And he's like, "What?" And all of a sudden, the bumper sticker on the truck that was pulling away. It's like, you have no idea. I am like that kid that notices the flower and the cloud and the lizard. And that's me at almost 57 years old. And so I'm not going to let it go. It's given me so much.
Your dad had like this vibrancy, and was like, "I'm going to run 1 million marathons in 1 million days." And I'm over exaggerating, but not by very many.
My dad was Forrest Gump.
Yes. Yeah. And
he ran across the country. He ran 100 marathons. Yeah. Bless his heart. He has dementia now, and is a lot of that's those bygone days, but he's got such beautiful, like a glow in his eyes still.
Yeah, you remind me, though, Zander, of that where you go, there you are. You're happy. But as a friend of yours, one of my favorite things to do with you is vent. Because you can go to a cynical place out of loyalty and out of love, but you're also going to be like, but only because I'm looking at this stained glass window and I'm still happy in my mind, right? And so I think there are ways we can dance into all the feelings in healthy ways, even if one of the spaces is our favorite. But my hope is more people in the world, as they're finding themselves in uncomfortable spaces, will find ways to joyful or happy or figure out what love is in that location and in that space. And it's not this, what I'm not saying is if you're sleeping on the sidewalk, you have to have the same joy as if you're sleeping in the Marriott, because your body's going to hurt, and there are different ways of having joy and love and hope. And so I think the more we have really robust lives, we get to learn, what does joy mean for me when I'm sleeping in a tent? What does joy mean for me when I'm sleeping at the Marriott? What does joy mean for me in Hawaii? What does joy mean for me on a cruise? And some of us get the chance to explore that, and others of us explore it a little bit less. But I wish that we honored and valued the ways that people find happiness or find their own kind of peace in whatever pieces of the world they end up in.
Thank you for tuning in to the Umbrella Hour. You were just listening to Dr. Reverend Megan Rohrer. On our next show, we will have a